I'm really excited for the next 2 weeks and all the things that are going to be happening, and I hope that many of you who engage the network will be sharing things as well, and so joining conversations. To just kind of welcome you to this session and give you some context. We are, the three of us, myself, Elisa and Ella, met 2 years ago now in Norway on the winter summer school that's run by the Creative Economies Research Network. And we've kind of been informally meeting up and chatting since then to share some of our work, and we're kind of connected by the fact we're all doing PhDs and trying to navigate that together and using community economies. And we kept sort of talking about where there might be crossover between our work, and I think the concept of boundaries and boundarying was something that came up a lot for us. And so, you know, the concept of when we study a place, how do we boundary that place? Or is it important for us to kind of put a boundary around that place, or can it be more nebulous and more porous? So the three of us work with various different concepts of community in place. Ella's working with the concept of bioregioning. Elisa works with cooperatives and land reform. And I work in the idea of community university partnerships. And we, as I sort of said, we began to kind of recognize the complexity in how we define place, and more importantly, boundaries. And this session is kind of an opportunity for us to take some of the questions that were coming up for us and kind of share that with the wider research network and the Community Economies Research Network, and well, as the Community Economies community, I guess. And we also kind of wanted to say that we don't necessarily, this session isn't about us wanting to collectively try and define what we mean by boundary in place. We're really interested in kind of opening that out and seeing how everyone else interprets what a boundary in their work might be, or what place might mean. But this is just an opportunity for us to connect with some other people and start to kind of open up that concept of place, boundaries, and space. So I've introduced us, but we'd really love to kind of get to know everyone in the room. So I'm going to hand over to Ella.
Yeah, thanks, Will. So what we really like is if people are happy to kind of turn on their cameras, turn on their microphones and have a chat, that's great. If you're not comfortable, you can use the chat function, or you can also just stay quiet if you prefer. But to open up the session, because we're thinking about place and boundaries, we thought a good place to start is in kind of line with community economies, start from where we are. So we'd love to hear from you, kind of your name, the place you're in, and the place of your research or practice, kind of however you want to define that. So we'll go around the three of us to start with, and then once we invite you to introduce yourself, if you could just hand on to the next person, that would be great. So I'm Ella. My place, I guess, is Sheffield at the moment, but through my PhD, that was moving between Sheffield, Nottingham, and my two case study sites, which were in Scotland and in Maine, USA. So that's my place and the places of my research. So I will hand over to Will.
Hello, I'm Will. And my place currently is what feels like a bit of a broom cupboard in the business school of the University of Bristol, which is a kind of political issue at the moment because we've been moved offices, and what we've been handed is much worse than what we had before. But so come to you from this place, which kind of leads me nicely into the place where my work is focused. And again, that is the University of Bristol, and the connections that the university has to the creative industries of Bristol as a city. And so those are my places. Lisa.
Hi, so my place currently is also Bristol, but I come originally from a tiny island in the south of Brazil. And it's the place where I have, like, where my heart belongs to. So yeah, and my research is also in Brazil, and I work with the landless workers, and I'm gonna tell a little bit more later, but I'll pass it on to Emily, if you feel like.
Hi everyone, I'm Emily, and My place is in rural North Carolina, and this is Hammy, who I think is picking up on some anxiety that I have surrounding currently being in rural North Carolina. My place that I do my research is in the oceans generally, and also places surrounding the oceans, like coastal areas, and in the Bahamas in particular.
Do you want to nominate someone to go next, Emily?
Oh, sure. I'll nominate Tim, since I know Tim. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Emily. Emily and I, we met on the summer school 3 years ago. I can't remember. Anyway, a while ago. Nice to see you. Yeah, so my place, I live in Dorset in Bridport. And I'm just hopefully getting to the end of a part-time PhD, which has been looking at the sort of the intersection between community-led housing and how to make it sustainable and the challenge of doing that. And we've been doing quite a lot of work around bioregional materials. And so I've become really interested in this question of place and space and boundaries and all that sort of stuff. So, and I'll pass to, I can see, Christina.
Hi everyone. Sorry if I kind of hi all. I might switch off my camera because my internet is not so stable, so I'll be here. So I'm Christina. I'm a socially engaged artist researcher. I'm currently based in Malta. I am from Malta, tiny island in the Mediterranean, and I guess my place of practice and research mainly currently it's Malta as well. So I'll pass on to someone I don't know. So Rob.
Sure. Hello, I'm Rob. I am currently a research fellow in cultural value at the Centre for Cultural Value at the University of Leeds. But I'm based, you see a little bit here of, it's a hill, Baildon Moor. This is all part of Bradford. So I think a lot of my work, my research, but just generally kind of my life, cultural life is actually more in Bradford, which is looking ahead to a city of a year of culture, as the UK capital of culture for next year. So I guess I've had a lot of questions around kind of what that means for a place, for a city. I think these are very kind of live questions I have with different organizations, and it's partly in my own research, but also within my own practice with artists. I work a lot with emerging digital artists and immersive artists. So yeah, kind of all around here around Bradford. Bradford's a very long district in the north of England, for those of you who don't know, which kind of has cities and towns and lovely green rural areas, as you can see. So that gives you a little sense. Shall I pass it on to Claudia?
Hi, hello. I'm Claudia. I'm also based at the University of Bristol currently. So I moved from London to Bristol to be a senior researcher on a project called Fair Creative Economies, which is very much based sort of around in the kind of region of Bristol and its neighbouring city, Bath. And so we've had conversations about what that means, what boundary that kind of draws. I'm also involved in sort of emerging social movement here in Bristol called the Bristol Commons network, which again is very local. And then I've the last year or so been involved in a research group looking at kind of mental health ecosystem in Trieste in North Italy. So that's a kind of a completely different region. So I guess for me it's interesting thinking about what it means, and what it means for I suppose, for organising ecosystems and kind of community economies and community wealth building, and what that includes and maybe what it doesn't include. Yeah, and I'll pass it to Boris.
All right, so hello everyone. So my hometown is Warsaw, Poland, but I'm living in central Italy where I'm doing my PhD, and I'm researching mountain villages in central Italy and their postal offices. So and I would say that will be my place research-wise, and then and the challenge of thinking about, let's say, place identity and the relations between those small villages and bigger places and other places is very well central to what I try to do. And now I am in Paris. I'm on a research stay in France for the next month. So I think Aviv, you should go now. It's the last one.
Hi, I'm the last one. Hi everyone, I'm Aviv. I'm the CEI liaison for this session, which means I'm just going to be sketching and taking notes. I'm in a city called Hull in the north west of England, in a neighborhood, the Boulevard Hessel Road neighborhood, and that's kind of where my research is located. I'm in the offices of a housing charity, which has a really interesting history here in the neighborhood, 40-year history, which is the site of a lot of my research and kind of also community work. I'm interested in mapping this thing I call neighborhood-based community ecologies. So these are kind of social enterprises that work on a neighborhood level. So the boundary of place for me, like the one I'm most focused on is neighborhood. And if I'm the last one, then I'll pass it back to Ella, Lisa, and Will.
Thank you. We're gonna have more time to explore your research, the things you were doing. And I'm just gonna share with you a few slides. Let me see if it's working. Can you see my slides now? Yeah. Okay, so the idea for the session today, as Will mentioned before, we don't have expectations in terms of closing the discussion or finding, an answer about what are boundaries, how place-based research or activism, like finding the conceptualization for it. But we're much more interested in opening up space for this kind of discussion, and we think Ljubljana is a really good place for that, because we're all somehow interested in similar things, or at least we start from the same point, theoretically speaking, and then but we like how this manifests in reality is very unique for each one of us. So as we did just now, like we kind of got to know each other a little bit better, but we're gonna have more time for that later on. We thought that maybe as a starting point, the three of us would share with you what we think about boundaries, place, land, and how our research practice is using this or playing with these concepts in different ways. And then we would split into smaller groups to have a discussion about how does this concept manifest in your own work. And then afterwards, we would come back together and just collect some ideas, some thoughts on what it means, boundary for the different groups and different people. Yeah, did I miss anything, Ella and Will?
No, I think that sounds great.
Okay. So I think I'm gonna start here just sharing a little bit of my own research. As I mentioned before, I come from Brazil. And right now I'm looking into a social movement called MST. In Portuguese is Movimento dos Trabalhadores Rurais Sem Terra. In English, it roughly translates to the movement of landless workers. And I'm particularly interested in how once they get access to land, so basically this movement, what they do is like they occupy land that is it's unproductive, or land that was bought just for speculation. They occupy this land, and after a government analysis, when they understand, yeah, this land is not being used properly, it's not serving a social environmental purpose in any ways, it's not creating jobs, it's not restoring the land in any ways, it's not protecting an ecosystem. Once they understand that that's what's happening with that land, they lease the land for MST. And then MST splits the land into different members, into different groups, and these groups start producing food in this land. So it's a social movement that is pushing for land reform in Brazil. And usually what they say is, if you want us to stop existing or stop doing what we're doing, just do land reform, and we won't need to exist anymore, because in Brazil they're not very well seen, because again there's a big history of colonization of land, and the land is very concentrated in the hands of few people, few families, which if you trace it back, you see that it has roots in the colonization of Portugal. So my first interest in MST is seeing land as a boundary, like access to land as a boundary, and what shifts once you get access to the land. Because these are peasant workers that they used to have land in the past, but they lost because of, land speculation and many other things. And then once they get access to land again, what shifts? What openings they have starting as soon as they get the land. So this is the first, I would say the first angle where boundary seems like an interesting concept to use in my own research. And then after that, once they have access to the land, some other aspects of boundaries really interest me. So for example, who defines the boundaries? How this land is divided? Usually what happens is that government gives to MST members land that is really devastated, like land that is really, really, really unproductive. So for example, land where people cut all the trees, or that previous industry used to exploit the land to get either wood or minerals or whatever is in the land. And then once the land is completely exhausted, they completely leave the land and don't use it, just keep it for speculation, financial speculation. So once this land is given, like, who defines the boundaries? How do you decide that this is what the new settlement of MST is going to look like? And usually you see rivers nearby, you see animals, but like they don't really participate in the decision, of course, of defining the boundaries. So this is one of the things that really interests me. And the other thing is that usually the neighbors produce traditional crops like soybeans or corn that usually is sold for exportation. So MST members, you can see here in the picture that there's kind of a boundary here and a boundary in this side. So they have to enforce some new boundaries within the boundaries of their land to protect their food production from poisoning from the other farms. So it's quite interesting to see as well how they have to play with the neighboring farms, because they are also exposed to chemicals, and usually they produce organic food. And just like as two final points, and then I'll pass it on to Ella, is that there is a really interesting shift that happens once these workers get access to the land. And one of them is this feeling that the boundaries start to get blurred. So in my data collection, I saw many of the members mentioning the land as almost like a very close person, someone really close to their heart. And in some instances, they were like, "Oh, she," because in Portuguese, land language has like gender, so land is she. And then one of the members, he was like, "She doesn't want to produce at the moment, so we have to respect her and we have to tend to her needs." So it's really interesting to see that there's no separation, real separation, or the separations start to become less obvious because they see food production as a co-creation, land restoration as a co-creation as well. So for me, this sounds very interesting and very curious to observe as well. And then because of this new relationship established with the land, new imaginaries also open up because they see that the struggles to access land were worth it. So potentially they can continue with other struggles to have a better society as well and extend, you know, the benefits created by MST in other aspects of societal life as well. So yeah, that's how I'm seeing boundaries in my research. And I'm gonna hand over to Ella for her own research as well.
Thank you so much. And I'm so excited that people have already mentioned bioregions. What does a region mean? How do you understand neighborhoods? Because this speaks so directly to my PhD research. So I finished my PhD this year. So if anyone wants to read it, I can send it, but I'm not sure how entertaining it will be, but there's some nice pictures in there. But my PhD was really exploring this idea of what does it mean to live well together in particular places. So community economies draw on the idea of living well together. And for me, the kind of layer of thinking about bioregions is what does that mean in the place we actually live? So I worked with two groups. There was a group in Scotland, which you can probably tell from the image on the screen. This is the Scottish example, and a group in Maine, America. So two quite different places, but also with a lot of shared history between them as well. And both of those groups were using this idea of bioregioning to frame their work. Can I have the next slide, please? So for people who aren't familiar with the idea of bioregionalism or bioregional thought, it starts with this way of seeing the world as defined by bioregions. So rather than taking a kind of political boundary, so a town, a administrative region, a municipality, a nation state, it starts by looking at the natural landscape around us and saying, kind of, what is the like natural definition of the world? So for me, living in Sheffield, I might kind of associate my life with the watershed of the River Don, or the area just before you reach the Peak District. But you have this feeling where when I'm at home, I'm in one place, and at some point I cross a border and maybe the ecology changes, the geology changes, the kind of species that are there changes. And at that point, I'm somewhere else. So it's really rooted in this idea that kind of land and place isn't just something that's defined by humans. We live in an area which is also naturally defined. Can I have the next slide, please? So if you've kind of got into this body of literature before, you might be familiar with some version of this quiz on the screen. So this is the bioregional quiz. I think this is the first version that was published, but you see lots of different kind of reinterpretations of this. So the idea is if you have a look at some of these questions and see how many you can answer. So where does your drinking water come from? What soils are you standing on? How long is the growing season? What are the native species? And part of this is to kind of inventory the knowledge you have about living sustainably, but it's also slightly a provocation that actually we don't know the answers to many of these questions. So if we don't know kind of what can grow where we live or how much rain we get, how can we expect to live there sustainably? So part of this is a kind of provocation to get you to think, actually, we don't know very much about the physical worlds that we live in. Next slide, please. And then you get this idea of bioregionalism, and that's when this kind of ontology of the world is made up of a series of bioregions, becomes more of a kind of eco-philosophy about how do we actually live sustainably in place. So the ideas that underpin this is kind of firstly building a sort of love for the place that you live in, a kind of want to care for it because you live somewhere, you know it well, you know, you belong there, this sense of belonging. And that's not just as a human, that's maybe with other species that exist there as well. So part of it is about this connection to place and building this identity, this cultural association with the place that we live. So in this image here, this was us going around in a coracle, which is a boat which you make out of cowhide and willow. And that was a boat that kind of traditionally would have been sailed around lochs in Scotland. It's really difficult, by the way. I didn't get anywhere in this, but part of it is about connecting to these kinds of cultural aspects of place. And the second part is literally learning what it means to live sustainably there. So how can we farm sustainably? Are there any kind of customary practices that we could reinvigorate to live sustainably, and things like that? So lots of this seems really positive, but you also might be maybe getting a few kind of alarm bells about this way of thinking. So there has been kind of more eco-fascist versions of bioregionalism. So you get language of carrying capacities. How many people can this landscape support? And therefore, who should belong there and who doesn't? It could also be you're thinking about what species are native, can quite quickly become who is native, who belongs, who's allowed to be here, and who should we exclude? And then philosopher Val Plumwood as well talks about the idea of shadow places, and that when we're doing bioregionalism, we might be trying to, you know, care for these really beautiful places that we live, but actually we're ignoring the shadow places that actually support our lives. So for me, living near the Peak District, it's a beautiful landscape, it's very easy to love, but my food isn't coming from there. The clothes that I wear aren't made there. But you can have this very privileged environmentalism that's concerned with just the place that we live. Next slide, please. So the groups that I'm working with are turning this into a verb. So they use the idea of bioregioning, bringing your bioregion into existence, kind of constructing that place. And for me, that shifts away from this kind of association with bioregions as really fixed, kind of reactionary understandings of place that Doreen Massey might describe. So, you know, there's an inherent identity, particular ways of knowing and living that shouldn't change. And it becomes something more progressive. How do we bring a place that is more than human, that is kind of sensitive to different cultural understandings, but is also still open to change, and those boundaries can be redrawn? So to me, this idea of bioregioning became about engaging with those questions of boundary making. So where are we? How do we draw that line? Who lives here? How do we live here? Who counts as part of that togetherness? Not just humans, but more than humans as well. But they still use this idea of a bioregion. It's not throwing it out entirely. And for me, that was about using boundaries as a way of making interdependence visible. So you can start to see who are you sharing this place with once you start to draw a line around it. So rather than kind of erasing our interdependence with other people or other species, is a way of kind of bringing it into visibility. But that only really works when you keep that boundary in tension. When bioregioning is about engaging with those questions of who and what belongs, how are we drawing the boundary today? And it might be different tomorrow, or it might be different for a different purpose. But the more tension was kept in that boundary, the more useful it was. So I don't want to go over too long, but we can pick up more of how that relates to community economies a little bit later. But for now, I'll hand over to Will.
Hello. So my work is, as I kind of mentioned previously, based on the kind of assemblages and the complexities of the relationships that form between academic researchers and universities, and the sort of those outside of the university. So for me, that could manifest as a community organizational group wanting to work with an academic on something of social justice topic, or it could be an artist who is collaborating with a researcher to explore a specific topic. But before I kind of delve a bit into that, I want to sort of clarify that when I use the phrase or the word "the university" within what I'm about to talk to, that sort of that is in direct relation to kind of the organization of the university and its business practices, the senior management team, its bureaucratic processes, and the buildings in the city in which it owns or rents. It's not the academic research staff, it's not the students, and it's not the professional services staff. And to give you an idea of what I mean by the university, having worked for many years in sort of a public engagement or a facilitation role that would, where I'd work with communities to work with academics, that would often become like a slur as the university, or a very quick shorthand to refer to something else. And that's why I've included this sketch here, because this is kind of the personification of what when I sort of spoke to participants within my PhD research, I asked them to personify what they thought the university was, and it came up with this sketch, which is kind of a male figure in an ill-fitting suit, often quite sweaty, curious, but always stealing ideas, hands full of cash, but not sharing that out, and sort of being quite extractive of the city and the communities that it's working with. And before sort of talking a little bit about where I find boundaries in this research and in this work, I wanted to kind of situate myself in the conversation and sort of give you some context as to where the PhD came from. So I worked for nearly a decade, as I've said, facilitating relationships between people inside and outside of the university, and working in many sort of different civic roles. And often that would manifest as kind of producing arts projects that were socially engaged, or working with people who had a kind of participatory methodologies, either in their research or in their art. And in that time, I started to notice a kind of change in the rhetoric from many UK universities, that they were becoming civic spaces. And civic in their sense, meaning that they were going to start shaping research projects and actions that would help to kind of improve local communities and society kind of within their locality. But this meant that in the UK, with various different political climates, that universities were almost forming relationships that were detrimental to a lot of these communities. So because of repeated kind of cuts to state funding for various different community resources, we're seeing many researchers, or the university as an organization, kind of step in and sort of take the place of those community not to take the place of the kind of state within this landscape. And by doing so, it meant that there wasn't really they were sort of trying to perform this role that wasn't necessarily their strategic position within society. And we're finding that it was almost driving higher precarity in some of the areas who were either marginalized or registering high on the indices of deprivation, and causing some quite fractious relationships. So I decided to move into this research area to try and unpick some of those relationships and understand where some of these frictions and tensions were coming from. So there was a lot of work thinking about this from a decolonial perspective. There was a lot of work thinking about the different kind of racial tensions and the different tensions in marginalization that the power of the university was driving. But what I wanted to understand was coming at this from a kind of community economies lens, and starting to understand all the various different ways in which a university actually could be a better resource for community groups who are engaging with it in the context of social or climate justice research. And when I was doing a lot of that work, lots of people would mention barriers to engagement. But I started to understand that, and these barriers being driven by power imbalances, and the power imbalances that many of us know, and organizational practices. But I was interested in digging into those on a micro scale, and thinking about how kind of bureaucracy and various different organizational practices sort of shaped and affected different people trying to engage with the university. So could you move on to the next slide, please, Lisa? And this is still quite early work, and I've only really just finished data collection and sort of in the middle of processing. But I think the best way to kind of try and emanate boundaries within my work is I've kind of started to break those barriers open into what I'm calling borders, boundaries, and breaches. And through borders, I started to understand kind of the different positions and the different roles that each of the actors play within these relationships. So, and roles that are kind of performed or placed on people by the university itself and the university as an organization. So I wish there was better quality in the photo. But roughly, I've sort of started trying to categorize and actually use boundaries in order to kind of understand where people are placed in these relationships and how sort of being placed in those relationships and often unable to move between roles drives these tensions and creates this very specific or prescribed role for them within the relationship. And some of the ways I've tried to start doing that is to think about sort of the omnipresent roles. So there's the funder that is often referred to, there's the university, but no one can really tell me who or what that person or thing is, understanding that there are humans behind a lot of these actions. And then we have a kind of granularity of the types of researcher or the types of collaborator that come into these relationships and into these roles, and thinking about different sorts of practices and different ways in which those manifest. I think I'll stop there because otherwise I'll probably go over the time that I've taken, but yeah.
So,
mate, sorry.
yeah, would you like to explain what we're doing next?
Sure. So maybe if I'll introduce this bit, and then maybe if we take a little break, just because I realize that it's a 2-hour session and people might want a bit of a comfort break or a chance to grab some water or refreshment. But we wanted to kind of invite you to do the same that we've just done and start to reflect on where boundaries or place kind of manifests in your work. And we were going to split people into a couple of breakout groups just to mainly have discussions around these points. Where these also aren't, we don't want to prescribe these points to you. If you feel like there's other ways that you'd like to explore boundaries within the groups, please do so. We're also, we'd love to kind of capture some of the discussions, and I'll share a link because we've created a Google Drive for you to put down some notes. But if it's easier for you to sketch or kind of express yourself in any other form, please do that, and just we'll probably meet back. It was in half an hour, wasn't it, to kind of share some of those thoughts together and have a bit more of a kind of wider conversation about how boundaries are manifesting in our work. All right. So if we take a 5-minute break, maybe meet at 10:02, and then we'll put you into breakout rooms. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Will.
I was wondering, do we want to take a group consensus? Because I think a few people have left, and I know Bianca, you need to leave as well soon. Do we want to stay as a main group actually, rather than going off into breakout rooms?
Yeah, we could
Yes.
do if it's a small team of us. And I'm happy to take some notes on behalf of everyone. So then, if that works, then we don't miss out on what anyone's got to say either.
Yeah. Just feels a bit nicer, doesn't it?
I'll paste the questions in the chat, so then we can have, like, if you need some prompts, you have some questions in the chat, but don't feel like you have to refer back to them. It's just a way to start the conversation.
I've also just posted that link in the chat, which has the questions on the second slide. So if anyone needs to refer to those. Did anyone have any, I guess we didn't give space for questions after any of our presentations or anything like that. Does anyone have anything that they wanted to kind of expand on or think about or share?
Maybe I want to share something. Like, I have lots of thoughts going around. Thanks for your presentations. It was really fantastic to listen to you. And there was lots I could connect to in each of the presentations. Like, for instance, the one of the university, and how do you deal with that you are seen as some kind of alien entity that wants to appropriate things. And I mean, it's really difficult to navigate. But also, I think for me, it's really interesting to think of where is the boundary between me and the land, and how to talk about that. Also, and especially how to talk about that in Europe as well, because I think often we projected that this, is something that happens in Brazil, but it's not happening in Europe. And I think, and I'm quite convinced that we still have people who also in Europe are totally feeling that boundary and living it and are in it, but it's very marginalized as a discourse. So it's not coming up at all. And then I wonder how that at times also connects to this eco-fascist version of me and the land. Because it's something I feel a very strong connection to the place I grew up in the Alps, and I'm like, this is my place. I just feel like I really belong here, but I don't want it to be an exclusive relation. I totally think that whoever comes here, in their lifetime, they also need to belong here, and they need to be allowed to feel that connection. And so there really, I'm very confused of how not to fall into a language that goes into this very exclusive, I'm born here and that's why I feel it. Because actually, I feel it strongly. I grew up here. I've been playing on these little rivers, and I just have it like really in my bones somehow. But then I wouldn't want to be an exclusive, something that excludes others. So I wonder if in your research you have come across, how do you navigate that kind of contradiction?
Can I respond to that one? I feel like I could talk about this for days. So I feel like that is the kind of tension that just ran through my whole thesis. And the groups that I was working with were really, really aware of that tension as well. And that's where I see a kind of movement to a sort of new form of bioregionalism that's really engaging with that difficult question of this feeling of belonging and love and connection to place does things. And some of that is really positive. It makes us care for place. It makes us feel like part of a community. It connects us to the specific forms of nature, not just like nature or the world as something abstract we need to care for, but the specific forms of nature and how they connect to each other. And so that's really, really positive. But that form of belonging can also exclude. It has the potential to say, there's one way of living in this place. It's for these people, and no other way is possible or should be allowed, or even like environmental determinist ways of like seeing the world. And so there was always that tension between those two ways of thinking. And some of my participants would say, I found this language of bioregioning. These are my people. We're all talking about the same thing. And then some person in the room will go, oh, great. And yeah, we should get rid of all the migrants as well. And then you suddenly go, actually, no, that's not what I'm talking about. But you can see how the language or the practice or the way of thinking can go in that direction. So they're always navigating this kind of feeling of wanting this connection to place and community, and understanding that there may be specific practices or ways of living or ways of understanding the world that make sense in one place that's different to other places, but trying to do that in progressive ways. So for me, that's where turning it into a verb becomes quite useful, becomes a way of like navigating and then acknowledging that you're constructing place, not just, it doesn't just exist, you know, you're part of that construction and that creation of those boundaries. So I think the kind of bioregioning language is one way of doing that. It has its own kind of baggage and politics. And I also found there was a kind of tendency to say this way of like working and being in place is bioregioning. So any other language that other people have for that similar practice, so whether it's kind of indigenous ontologies, you know, like the idea of country in Australia, or in Scotland, there's an idea of dukas, which is about this connection between people and land. There was also sometimes a tendency to take that and say, oh, well, that's just bioregioning. And the language can kind of be colonial in itself and kind of trying to encompass all these different place-based ways of knowing. So for me, that's why this idea of boundaries is quite interesting, because it's about how do you draw that boundary so you get all of that productive stuff that people really resonate with and like really motivates them, but doing it in ways that's kind of critical. And yeah, sorry, that's a bit of a rambly answer, but I'm trying to summarize like 80,000 words of thesis into an answer to your question. But yeah, I guess that's my response. I don't know if any of the other speakers want to add to that.
I felt like very similar things in terms of when I view the university as a community. So I think a big part of the problem with working in the space that I am and was that a lot of researchers didn't actually view themselves as part of the community in which they were studying. And even when you asked them to kind of define the research community, they couldn't do that. So I think that was my sort of starting point, was how do we define a community like within the research community? What is the research community? And what is their intention for working with communities? Because as I said, the kind of civic rhetoric is that they were just working with everyone. So the university became for everyone. So there was no way to boundary who came in, who wasn't there, who could be there as an external rhetoric, but internally, obviously, the bureaucracy was basically like you had to be a very specific person with a whole load of qualifications, a certain way of like performing, acting, a socialization into that space. And so it very, very quickly became apparent that those boundaries were there and lots of people were sort of like contained within that. I'm not really sure that sort of added anything, but just this idea of the porosity of the university kind of belonging to everyone because it's this public or supposedly public place. And especially during Tony Blair's kind of movement to for a lot of people my age in the UK, we all went to university and did undergraduate because that was the thing. So it was opening up universities, but now we're all stuck with a huge amount of debt because, you know, it was a higher interest rate than we realized. So all these things of where the universities become open, but actually on the face of it, it's really not. So how a rhetoric can appear like open, but actually it's very closed as a place. Aviv, did you have a separate question? Or were you wanting to add to the... Oh, you're on mute still.
I'm just wondering about this particular question, and I'm always wondering about ecofascism in terms of to what extent ecofascism really plays on a real connection to place, or on the opposite, on the feeling of disconnect that a lot of people feel. And then they fill that void, that lack of connection, with the image of a connection to place, or with a discourse of the connection to place that's very essentialized and simplified. It doesn't really have to do with the real experience of being in that place. That's usually quite diverse, especially nowadays. And I don't have, I mean, an answer, but But if someone has some thoughts about that, I mean, I'd be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I'm sure Elisa does as well, but I'll just jump in because I think for me, the Doreen Massey idea of like reactionary understandings of place, which are kind of rooted in this sort of like fear of not having a connection to place or feeling placeless, or kind of, yeah, reaction to this idea of globalization and things like that. And yeah, I think that is kind of where some of that sort of eco-fascist part of it can come from. And I think what's helpful then is thinking about place as something which is that is always changing, it is dynamic. But I think there is still something about a boundary in that as well, that just because something has maybe a boundary doesn't mean it's automatically a kind of reactionary understanding of place. Or, you know, some people have said to me, well, bioregions, doesn't that just become another way of ordering space that might as well be the nation state? And say, well, actually, no, you've got this idea of boundaries, but they can be more progressive, or they can be more porous, as Will said, or, you know, dynamic. And that for me is more like progressive way that kind of gets away from this sort of, yeah, reactionary drawing of boundaries. That yeah, I'm not sure if that's quite answering it, but yeah, for me it's this like way of seeing place as something that can be changing and dynamic, but still kind of bounded and still has a sort of sense of place about it, but is still open to change and possibility. But I'm sure Elisa's got some kind of interesting responses from her case study work as well.
I mean, I don't know if I have like a straight answer or comment, but I might go like around sharing some thoughts and then we can make sense of it together. But from my case study, what I think is really interesting is that usually when for example, they occupy a particular land, and usually this is not the land that is leased for their use. Usually the government is analyzing like 1,000 cases and then occupying one land, kind of speed up the process. And then usually the land leased is far, far, far away from this, where usually these people are from. So they are kind of dislocated from their original place to a new place, and they have to start from scratch. And then when they get to this new place, there's this crazy narrative around these people are troublemakers, these people don't want to work, these people are just here to disturb our community. And then like one of the boundaries is like this idea of community as this tight space where people were loving each other, you know, like people were caring for each other. But then the reality shows that it's not actually the case. And usually when these settlements are when the settlements start in a particular place, they usually kind of like they kind of shift or improve the way this community works, because hi, welcome. So usually like these settlements, they disturb initially, in the sense of there's a bunch of new people, we don't know these people, and we're very, very protective of this community. But then like infrastructure starts to appear in the place, because these groups of people, they really push the government to change or to create positive change where they are. So usually there's new roads, but not in a way of you know, like pushing just transformation by transformation itself, like much more of how can we improve the lives of these people and bring more transport and all of this. So I think the mere presence of these groups of MST members in the community kind of flexibilizes the idea of what community is and what community could be. But this is not to say that they don't have to push back on a lot of prejudice and fight for spaces to kind of co-create these communities. And I heard quite a few stories that they were heartbreaking, like even in school, kids, like the the kids from MST members going to school and being pushed away by their colleagues just because they were part of MST and because they were reproducing, like the kids were reproducing these narratives around troublemakers and, you know, all of that. But then also like these kids would be, look, if you want to learn from us or about us, come and join us, visit us. And then this kind of creates the porousness in the boundaries and kind of allows some flexibility in reassessing what's community could be. I don't know, again, I'm just sharing ideas.
Does anyone want to share an example kind of from their own research or practice, or maybe how they're encountering boundaries in their own work?
Emily, hey.
Hi. Yeah, so I think about boundaries a lot as someone who works in the ocean in a lot of different ways, because the ocean is a particularly difficult space to boundary. And to me, it also, the whole notion of boundaries gets to ontologies about how we even think of the earth and the oceans as resources versus something entirely different. Because in my work in the oceans, there's several interesting boundaries, one being even this very false boundary between land and sea, of the notion as the sea is somehow separate, when that's not the case. We have liminal spaces. I do work in mangroves, which are both land and sea and neither land nor sea. And the sea kind of being othered as this unpeopled space in Western ontologies, as this unpeopled space that we can divide with data-driven boundaries that don't reflect this, and particularly someone who works in the Caribbean, that doesn't reflect, in the Atlantic in particular, the real histories, the lived histories of what it means to the Atlantic as a space of mass death and violence due to slavery. So, you know, in my work, I think about this a lot in terms of the people I work with in the Bahamas don't think about ocean boundaries in the same way, because they feel a broader connection to this diasporic identity that can't be geographically bounded. So when I think about in my work over how do I think about what communities need to protect their own access to ocean meanings and meanings of coastal spaces in this kind of increasingly globalized discourse about the blue economy that's largely relying on things like marine spatial planning and marine protected areas that are entirely based on bounding. So that's kind of where I think of it in my work. And then I also have this interest in global issues about how data is coming into all this. I'm working on a paper right now where we're looking at maps of oceans that are being produced by these large digital depositories of ocean data, and how in some cases they're stabilizing boundaries and in some cases they're actually unsettling boundaries by showing that data crosses them, but in a very different way than what I see on the ground. Or I haven't really started I've only done scoping work in the Bahamas. There's some permitting restrictions there. So I'm speaking in very early terms based on what I've seen in scoping, but and reading other Caribbean scholars' work. But yeah, so that's kind of where it comes in to being for me. And it's something I think about a lot in a space that is very difficult to bound. And I think when it is bound is often done in very neoliberal and colonial ways.
In terms of your thinking around that, have you started to sort of actually define how you draw your boundaries within that, or how does it feel like for you to be drawing boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is I don't draw them. So, you know, as I'm using, you know, Will, I know you're working with assemblage theory in your work, and that's one thing that I think about as well, because you know, I don't, it's hard. And one of the biggest challenges of planning my field work is bounding the case study, because obviously you have to still bound your assemblage somehow, and that's one of the biggest challenges. So yeah, I mean, to me, particularly as a white American person who's doing work in the Bahamas, I don't think, I'm just trying to remain open to seeing how the people I work with in the communities I will be working with really understand these notions of boundaries. And I think it's something, one of the folks one of my prospective community partners who's doing work on the mangroves has been talking about walking this fine line between needing to work with people who are pushing the blue economy and having this really different notion of what community means. And so I think thinking about how they're bounding these issues and how they're bounding spaces and what they see as kind of appropriate will be, I'll let them lead and I will follow. But if anyone has ideas or suggestions, because I'm still planning my field work, I'm happy to talk about that.
I'm just wondering if the more than human plays a role in also like creating these boundaries. And I think also like all these tensions around how these different groups conceptualize the idea of boundary in the ocean is also quite interesting, isn't it? Because again, as going back like to what you said in the beginning, it's almost like this place that don't belong to anyone or that no humans inhabit it. So then it's easier to just have like like a misconception or different ways of bounding the ocean.
Yeah, and I think the more than human is something I think about a lot, and it's something I have to be really careful about when I speak about it, because working in the Caribbean, using the phrase more than human can be problematic for some people who feel like they, more than human, we don't have justice for us yet, and now we're thinking about Earth others as being more than human. So even things like language for me is really challenging to work with there, because that I have always used the phrase more than human. And now I'm like, oh, I have to be really careful about doing that. But I do think things like, especially working with things like corals, these are organisms that resist boundaries, in the ocean in particular. There is an ecological resistance to bounding because of the mobility of the space. And so there's some wet ontologies work that was led by Phil Steinberg and Kim Peters, who are ocean geographers, in thinking about maybe we need kind of a different ontology to think about how we think of the mobility that is inherent in it's inherent in the materiality of oceans.
Fascinating, Emily. Thanks for sharing.
Hey, Chris.
Is it okay to just hi? Hello, everyone.
Hey.
I missed introductions, but I put a little in the chat. So hi, I'm an academic. I'm following up after Emily because sounds like you're a natural scientist, I think. And I'm no, but you study ocean. Okay, you're studying marine stuff, so but not that kind. Anyway, I am an engineer that got into kind of, I guess, learning about boundaries and doing accounting around boundaries related to like things that humans do, thinking that it, I think it does. I hit a button I don't want to share and now I can't get out of it. Anyway, so just the idea of the boundary being like a part, like I'm a modeler. Sorry, do a lot of quantitative things. Like we define the boundary like explicitly because that's how like the math works. And so, yeah, so it's really interesting to think about it as like flexible. And I mostly think about nitrogen and food systems and really nitrogen and nutrient pollution in the liminal spaces and the coastal estuaries and things like that. But yeah, I just wanted to jump in and just offer that like some of us are so hardcore trained to be like, it's like this, coordinate. And it's just, I appreciate kind of thinking about it differently. And I think food for me in particular, or like commodities, like the way that I've studied them in the past is looking at like global quantities of how much and done these really quantitative analyses of how do you get the population of Chicago's like full set of nutrition needs met like with the smallest land base. And so I kind of have come into agroecology and rural sociologist because I am ever learning more about just how people interact with the land and what it means for us and food and sovereignty and like, you know, all these other like very real things that weren't necessarily my academic path, but maybe my personal path. And I spent a lot of time just trying to resolve, for example, a bioregion was mentioned. And like 10 years ago, I reviewed a paper that was like, we should all be living within the food that we have in our bioregion. And I was like, well, is it enough though? Like most of the time it's not. And so there's this big question of sort of like wrestling with trying to be helpful, but also sort of within the rules of, I mean, neoliberal global trade, I guess. But at this point, I kind of am constantly in this like weirdness of like, it may be bad and it's supporting like billions of people to like literally survive. And then, so that's, but I feel like it's something has to give and some kind of, you know, middle ground of recognizing sort of these like hard physical realities and how you make things better and sort of get away from it or something. I don't know. So that's, I'm so excited already by everything I've already heard and just sharing the perspective of probably a quantitative modeler with an angle, and probably my training was really in like climate change policy. And now 10 plus years later, I see how it's kind of being like sort of weaponized and neutralized and all the kinds of ways usually progress gets assimilated or whatever. So excited about new paths.
Could you see a way in which the kind of the hard boundaries you speak of like would mesh, or I don't know, maybe adopt like a yeah, that kind of ontology that Emily was talking about of like
Yeah, I think that's the thing is like, how do we, or what I'm curious about is like, how do we, like, I think community-led organizing and like people on the ground who live in places and have like a knowledge of the place and just a different way of thinking about how we relate to each other in land, I guess, is important, and trying to understand more, like Emily was saying, about like, what does that mean to you and how would one like me also resolve this, like, I don't know, for me, it's just kind of like these materials flows that we kind of are reliant on now. Like, how do you kind of get into, I think maybe the culture, like changing how people, I'm totally out of my depth, but how people understand things can lead to the change that we need to see. And I guess I'm not totally, I mean, right now, like our global world is like falling apart, but I don't know, you know, it's kind of like get the resources where you can. And so my strategy has tended to be like, okay, if this is how people need to hear it to like bring down money to this community, like let's tell them it that way, while recognizing that it's sort of problematic, or I feel like I'm perpetuating something that's, I don't know, playing the game, right? So yeah, I'm gonna shush because I see hands up and I probably have some things to say.
Yeah, but that's super interesting. Thank you. Ella, did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to kind of just kind of maybe respond to sort of the idea of bioregions again, and like boundary making, because I also think often we're thinking about boundaries as drawing it as a line around a community, and I think there's also something really useful in what you're saying in terms of boundaries are also about limits, and sometimes you know, particularly from like a Western colonizing state, sometimes a boundary needs to be drawn to say, actually, this is what you can't have, or like this is where you can't go, and you know, this is what's your fair share. And sometimes I think it's useful to think about boundaries not just as the ones we're creating or like a community's creating around themselves, but also those barriers we encounter from other people, whether it's, you know, research participants saying, you know, you can't know this, or you can't have this data, or, you know, I don't want to do any more co-production because nothing ever happens, or whatever it is. Something about, you know, where other people are drawing lines. But also, you know, as you say, in modeling, boundaries are also useful. And I think for me, I need to, like, there's sometimes this thing that boundary making is bad. Like, as social scientists, you know, everything needs to be relational. Everything, you know, boundaries, or every time we draw a line, it's a bad thing. But actually, they are useful. They can be productive. But it's how do we use them? So yeah. But I also saw Boris had a hand as well, but I can see Tim's hands up. So whoever if you had a new point, Boris, I'll go to Tim first, if that's all right. Cool.
Hi. Is that okay? Boris doesn't want to speak? No? Yeah, so the work that I'm involved in is around affordable housing and community housing in particular. And this issue of boundaries, it has lots of sort of manifestations in that work. So one dimension that kind of makes me feel uncomfortable, but I think, you know, it needs to be addressed, is that in the UK, when community land trusts have been adopted, they're generally then linked to an allocations policy that defines who is able to become a member of that community land trust or benefit from the housing. And those people need to have a local connection. But that obviously then excludes those who don't have a local connection, and it has the potential to sort of, yeah, reinforce that kind of them and us sort of issue. So I think that it's an interesting dimension of this kind of affordable housing issue. And I think it's particularly noticeable in rural areas. Because we do, I mean, I live in a rural area and we have a crisis of affordable housing, particularly for young people. And you can see how you can very easily get into this thing of saying, well, if we make affordable housing, it should be, you know, the people who are priorities should be the people who have been here longest, or, you know, etc., etc. So I think that's one of the issues that we're interested in. I think another, I mean, it's an enormous area, but the other area which kind of follows on from what Chris was saying was that I'm interested in exploring the challenge of helping create affordable housing, but also housing that is more sustainable. But if you try and make housing more sustainable, the materials that you want to use are generally more expensive. And there's also the issue that if you set a boundary, let's say around Dorset or around the southwest, we actually haven't got all of the materials in that bioregion that we could build all of those houses. So then you get into the question, well, what's the proper, not proper, but, you know, what's the ideal balance of bioregional materials and materials that we bring in from elsewhere? And I think that the other area that I'm interested in exploring is that I do believe that we should be using more materials from our local area. And so, for example, we've been growing with local farmers hemp and flax, because those are traditional crops. And it's sort of, so then there's a question that I'm interested in, which is if you give people more of an experience, a kind of an embodied experience of materials, does that make them more interested in adopting more sustainable approaches to building houses? And so we've got down into saying, right, what's the geology underneath our feet? What's the landscape that allows the products to be processed, like rivers and mills? We have clays, but where we can use clay as a binder for something like hemp for insulation. And then we have other bits of the geology which is good for growing the fibers. And then we do workshops where we get people to process the fiber by hand. So there's a kind of embodied phenomenological dimension to all of this. But then again, there's this interesting question: does that make people more insular, or does it sort of start to give them a fascination in materials that can open up questions about the kind of flows beyond the locality or beyond the bioregion? And that's obviously what we're trying to do, but there's a question as to whether that focus on the tangibility of materials strengthens that sense of, oh, we've got to do everything locally and be autarkic and self-sufficient. So anyway, so those are some of the issues that we're kind of exploring, not with any answers, but I think these issues about boundaries are very relevant. And we're actually working with a colleague of mine, Zoe Gilbertson. I noticed Ella just put David Bollier in the chat, and his latest podcast is with a colleague of mine, Zoe Gilbertson, about some of the work that we're doing around fiber production and local textiles. And if anyone's interested, it's a really interesting podcast.
Would you be able to share the name in the chat, Tim, of this podcast?
Yes, yeah, if I will.
Thank you.
Boris.
Okay. Well, I was a bit shy to speak because I'm a planner and geographer, and for me, the questions of place and boundaries are just like never ending and very difficult. So, well, the broader is the vocabulary we have to speak about them, the better. So I really like the session. And unfortunately, what I can offer is not a very coherent thing, more of a stream of consciousness, but I hope you will excuse it. So while I was listening to your interventions, the one thing that comes to my mind is actually the book I'm reading right now, which is Kafka's Castle. I don't know if you've read it, but it's so Kafka's Castle is about bureaucratic boundaries in a way, but that the only way to become free is to dissolve boundaries, not to overcome them. And so there's the bureaucratic dimension of boundaries was, popping up here and there. And I was thinking a bit along the lines of Ella about what when boundaries are cleavages, whether there can be benevolent boundaries, when they are violent. So to problematize along these dimensions, to treat them maybe as tools, which can do things, but which can also be violent, and then maybe just keep that in mind. And in my own research, I didn't start with the idea of a boundary because I'm researching. I'm researching villages which were struck by an earthquake in Abruzzo region in central Italy, and one of the very few remaining public institutions there are postal offices for a number of reasons. But what I've seen in those postal offices, as opposed to postal offices in the big cities, is that there is a lot of sociality and a lot of care and emotional work being done by the postmasters who run those tiny places single-handedly. And then sort of the boundary became important in a way, because what is being breached as a boundary is the domesticity of social reproduction and care, because usually social reproduction and care is associated with home. But in these postal offices, the dwellers create a very familiar, in a way, atmosphere, because they engage in different rituals of bringing food, discussing very personal things. They invite the postmaster to their homes, and then on the other hand, postmaster invites them to the private area of the postal office if they need some intimacy. So there was the boundary, at least in my postal research, that this is being breached by these people. But in the urban environment, there's no space for that. It is very formal. But in those small postal offices, it is happening. And yeah, and the last thing, because we're speaking about boundaries, but maybe you can also speak a little bit about places and how we think about places. And what popped out in that research was the temporal understanding of place, not necessarily in a way Doreen Massey shows us, but what the research participants do, because they're usually elderly people, they engage in life reviews. So they come to the postal office and they recollect different memories of these places in which they lived before the earthquake, during the earthquake, afterwards. And they need this to maintain their kind of social, the self-image, to sustain themselves. So the place is kind of, has many temporal dimensions being relived in one moment. And so I was trying to write about it in that way also. And that this is a necessary resource for these people to be able to engage in this live accounts in public. So yeah, that would be my couple of words, not very coherent, but maybe somehow useful.
I think it was really coherent. Thank you. Aviva, I noticed you had your hand up as well, and Rob, we'll come on to you afterwards.
Yeah, what Boris was talking about made me think about, and there were quite a few mentions here about porosity of boundaries, and what I'm always interested on a neighborhood level when I'm talking about the kind of organizations that I'm working with is how the I mean, I'm looking to see what makes a kind of a rooted like alternative project, what can make it sustainable, what can make it give it longevity, kind of a generative, like say a project that generates many other projects in the neighborhood and kind of populates the neighborhood with a lot of different initiatives that kind of respond to different needs and creates social infrastructure and other kinds of infrastructure and resources in the neighborhood. So, and one of the things that I noticed is the porosity of organizational boundaries. And I think that Boris, the way he talked about postal offices, where the kind of the formal and the informal, the kind of things that, you know, you'd think are in the realm of friendship and family suddenly are happening in a kind of in a formal organization. And I see this as a very useful, because I mean, because it's quite pragmatic the way I'm, you know, I'm looking at what can generate, you know, I'm coming at it from an activist perspective, and I'm also seeing that that social movements also create a lot of boundaries through creating bureaucracies and protocols and stuff like that. So so that creates an inside and an outside to a lot of social movements. And in contrast, some of these neighborhood based organizational ecologies, that a lot of them come from social movements and kind of stepped outside of the traditional boundaries of social movements. So there's I saw that people talk about breaching boundaries, but a repeated daily small scale moment to moment breaching of boundaries creates porous boundaries, organizational boundaries, and that can confuse all sorts of traditionally political for and against kind of situations, and kind of slowly work against polarization and kind of activist bubbles, and also nourish organizations with new ideas, with connection to their environment. This is what I see in these kind of stigmatized neighborhoods that I'm working in. So I don't know if that was a question or a thought, or yeah.
No, I think it's super interesting because I just want to pick up on your point there about the breaches, and maybe elaborate on how I've been thinking about them, because it's the way in which I've been categorizing those is that a breach is when, for example, someone might funnel some money out to a community organization without it being kind of written in the budget, or it's me lending a book to someone who's not affiliated with the university from the library, or, you know, these sorts of ways in which it does become porous, and then it does become more porous, yes, but I think I would also kind of push back on that as that it further highlights a lot of the like the discrepancy between the access to and what, especially within the university, I suppose, like I'm talking about here specifically, but just continues to kind of maybe reaffirm some of those boundaries and or borders, in fact, and the barriers and like the ways in which like people are kept out of these spaces. Rob, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting hearing all these different perspectives. You know, for me, I'm looking a lot at kind of the policy around culture. Right now, I've been looking at Leeds and Bradford, and these are, you know, these have really incredible industrial histories. So as much as a city council, a district council might say, we want to use culture in order to kind of transcend these boundaries between the urban and the rural. When it really comes down to people's everyday lives, particularly in Bradford, it's down to postcode. Like tiny, minute, like it just within these streets. That's your identity, is that you come from BD5. And people are really proud of that. And it's incredible how that that kind of helps to restate for them kind of where their boundaries are. You don't cross over you don't go beyond that road beyond BD5. And yet what it means practically is that you have quite a few people who might live in very urban built up areas. We have green literally 2 kilometers away. You can see it in the distance, but they haven't been up on top of that bit of green that's two kilometers away. So it's an incredible divide that kind of gets passed on. I think a lot of that comes from the industrial heritage. I mean, I live in a mill here on the river. We're surrounded by mills, and it's constantly we're reminded of this kind of extraction history of the land and who's part of within this industrial bit, and the green that we have to leave unkept up, kind of pristine up there. So I think for us, we have this promise that culture can bring people together, but in reality, when you look at people's daily lives, these kind of the policies for our city councils promising us that culture can bring people together doesn't actually work. I would say I saw a glimmer of hope. I've just come back from Halle in East Germany. And this is a place where if we talk about fascism, I mean, that's proper fascism, a rise of the right of the AfD happening there. And I think if I've seen one glimmer of hope of like a kind of festival bringing people together, it's their science festival. And having you have people kind of crawling around like slime and all this. And this is happening in the city center in a place which is really seeing an incredible rise of the right. And it's one of the very few festivals I can really say that, science and using science as a cultural festival has been able to actually break down some barriers and bringing people together, even if it's only maybe, over a weekend or something like that. I've seen a glimmer of hope. Of where we can actually transcend those boundaries, because ultimately, yeah, people will go back to their daily lives, and particularly in a place here like Bradford, you kind of have your big divides. But I think for me, there is some hope in some of these cultural policies for what we might call social cohesion. So that's kind of what I'm looking at a little bit with like the Leeds City Council is, okay, you claim that culture brings us together. What does that actually look like? And it's so nice when it actually does happen, and I can actually point to some of those examples. So yeah, it's both for me, it's a practical thing, it's an actual like physical geographical thing, but it's also very much in the mind about kind of like crossing roads and staying within your postcode.
And wonder if that kind of speaks to something Aviv put in the chat earlier about terminology, and maybe if actually instead of it causing division, like if there's a common language or a common cultural thing that we can experience together, sort of works against that. Boris, did you had your hand up again?
Very shortly, just to comment on the postcodes, because there might be a historical reason behind that in the US context. For a community to be put on the map, it had to acquire a postcode. So the communities were fighting to get their postal office or postcode. And then it became kind of imbricated within the idea of civic rights, at least in the US. I guess maybe that was the case also in the UK. So maybe that is why this boundary is so cherished. Yeah, so just a very small comment.
I think it's interesting to hear that from like the US as well, because I tend to think that in the UK, particularly when people are talking about bioregioning, they're often talking about really, really small areas, like the watershed of a river or, a stream, like really tiny areas compared to in America and Australia, bioregions, people are talking about, great big landscapes, or there's like a one earth map of all the different bioregions in the world. We're talking about huge scales, whereas in the UK there's a very clear sense of communities that are quite small, and that you cross the road, you enter a different postcode, you go over a hill, there's a different accent, or people have a really different sense of identity. You got these like really small scale little bioregions that are different to how people see it in other places. And I think that's quite interesting that people see it at these like teeny tiny little scales, and that seems kind of relatively unique. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, these really small communities. Emily, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the issue of scale is a really interesting one, because I think you're right. Certainly in the United States, we do have these very large regions, but I think we also have smaller identities associated with, these bioregions. Like living in North Carolina, for example, which is, we have this artificially drawn boundary around this state that has massive diversity in ecosystems. I live on the coast. We have coastal plains, and then, of course, in the west of the state is mountainous. And so, and a lot of times those don't align with political boundaries. But when we think of bioregions on a national level in the US, they still are often represented with these artificial political boundaries that don't match the actual bioregions. But I think you can have it at multiple scales, right? You can have a large scale bioregion that you think about on a global level, or somewhere like in the United States, or like a continent, a larger scale. But then from a community economies perspective in particular, I think it's helpful to still focus on these smaller scale bioregions, because that's where you can make community even within these larger bioregions, recognizing, like smaller watersheds and areas where, there maybe more commonality of resources.
Yeah, and I think all of these kinds of connections we have to place or other forms of community that aren't placed, they're all nested and networked, and different aspects of them are important to you at different points in time as well. And I think, I just use the language of bioregions when I'm talking about my research, because that's how people are generally talking. But when I was working with the group in the Gulf of Maine, they were sometimes talking about themselves as the Casco Bay bioregion, sometimes as the Gulf of Maine, and sometimes even drawing on ideas of being connected to the Arctic and the Arctic Circle in ways that is very different to the rest of America. So all of these kind of place-based understandings were very scalar, but it wasn't in that kind of way of the biggest scale being the most important one. They were all happening in relation to each other. So yeah.
I just want to, I'm loving the conversation. It's so interesting to think of boundaries more as the human community. But I think what you're saying, Ella, about, it's interesting to hear that people that live in like the real nested watershed are aware of that, and they think of different things probably in relation to different scales, like being part of probably a bigger trade route or something if they're thinking about the Arctic. That's really cool. And yeah, I was just it's kind of related to something Tim said and Emily said about scale. And I was just thinking like it kind of depends on what's used to define your boundary, or what like action maybe you're trying to speak to. And like I've done a lot of work on nitrogen movement in the United States due to growing food. And yeah, it's thousands and thousands of farmers being motivated by national federal policy that leads to like millions of tons of nitrogen going into the Gulf of Mexico. So, and when we are a hydrologist, like if that's what you're after, like that's the scale, right? That is how the water drains, like physically, the extent of like where the water that falls on this land is going to go this way. And so like that hard boundary, I think, is something I think about a lot. But then we're trading food globally in and out of there. So then it's like this whole big thing. And then I just wanted to say something Tim talked about, which was like, I think how I think about, sometimes I hear solutions such as we're going to grow hemp in our community and we're going to mine some clay from a location, right? And that's sometimes that's held up as like this pinnacle of sort of sustainable or living within the land that you're on or something like that. And maybe it is, like, I really don't know. But my thought is always like, how many people could do that before, and there's a little bit of a chat of the commons, before there's not enough, you know what I mean? Like there's not going to be enough probably. So I get into the hardcore, like, so when I'm thinking of like boundaries and things, I'm thinking like, we have humans like massively disturbed like earth systems at every scale. And we're also here, and if we decided, okay, yeah, we should all be living in a certain way with these certain materials, like what I would do is like calculate, is that possible? And a lot of times it's not, you know what I mean? And so like there really are like very hard like limits in some case, and I'm really curious about like that. Just understanding in both directions, I think, is something I'm like really interested in, and there's a total lack of like this kind of discourse often, and it's certainly in engineering, and I think they need it, and I just anyway. So thank you, and that's what I just always learning more, but always kind of want to be like, but there are like limits, and sort of the reason that the certain boundaries are defined is because like the water does flow to that point or something, you know. I mean, certainly there's like all the nesting, but there's also the big is real too, is what I think I'm always trying to have a conversation about.
Perfect, thank you. I think we've got like 15 minutes left. So do we want to hear from Tim and Aviv, and then maybe we can do a bit of a wrap up. But Aviv, also maybe you could share some of the things that you've taken away from your notes. Go on, Tim.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to endorse very much what Chris just said. I think in the UK, the government said that we should be building 1.5 million new houses over the next 5 years. And yeah, I mean, it's been worked out that I think, I can't remember the exact number, but very soon you go over the kind of carbon budget that's been set by another bit of government. And you know, so there are some academics who say, actually, you know, if you look around, we have enough empty rooms across the country to meet our housing need. Do we really need to be building 1.5 million houses? And it becomes very complicated because in certain places you have got a housing shortage, and in other places you've got an excess of empty properties or empty bedrooms or whatever. But certainly in the work that we're doing, we're very much saying, what is a sustainable yield of timber, for example, in our area? And in the southwest of England, it's tiny. So the notion that we can build out the number of affordable homes that we need using timber, it's just not possible. Or, yeah, I mean, growing hemp is interesting, but we're so way off being able to turn that into construction materials. So, but kind of what I'm interested in is how do you marry that sort of technical scientific assessment of those limits, those boundaries, with all these other dimensions. There's this sort of, you know, there's a sort of justice transition, you know, people need homes, so that's got to be tackled. People don't understand about materials and therefore are not interested in using better materials. So we do need that. I think we do need that sort of, yeah, whatever you describe it as, you know, embodied engagement with materials. But it's just a sort of a very complex thing. But we certainly wouldn't be saying that the future is timber and hemp houses and that'll solve the problem. I agree entirely. We need to have all these different perspectives looking at the issue.
Aviv, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, this would be, if we had a lot more time, this would be a question for Chris, because I'm really curious in terms of how do you, or is there a way to bring into these calculations in terms of quantifying what available resources are necessary to feed and house and all these kinds of things, the people? How might you bring in all sorts of like doing some sort of scenario work, like considering cultural shifts that can happen, and the way I imagine it as quite unpredictable in terms of like some sort of massive cultural shift happens, and it's hard to tell then what the needs might be after things, you know, say. So I mean, because I come from an arts background, and the way we construct knowledge is quite different to the way scientists construct knowledge. We create, like, I call them what happens if questions, and they're open-ended questions. You do something, and then like a whole new situation is created, and it's hard to predict before you did it. Also, you know, coming from being an action researcher, it's hard to predict what this new scenario might be before you actually take action, and then suddenly, the room is different. You play a song and the room is different, and then only then what the following song needs to be. And I'm wondering how do you bring that into these kinds of calculations? And I understand that we're like running out of time, and it's like could be a really long conversation, but just curious about that.
Oh my gosh, yes, I would love to talk about that forever and ever. It's what I think about obsessively all the time. It's how I got here. Yes. I would say just in a nutshell, like how I've been trained to think about it, which is like science-informed decision making. And I'm a civil engineer by training. Like if you're going to invest in energy infrastructure, it's like a 50-year investment. So you just set up bounds of like, well, we can invest in this or we can invest in that, and how's that going to get us closer to the target? And then it's constantly adapting. So what I currently think of now is like trying to bring more voices in to set like what is our targets, and then responding as like, well, if that's the goal, here would be what I would do in 1, 5, 10 years, planning out like physically how we're going to start to move towards something else, like diet change. How do you make diet change? It's not going to be from me. It's going to be from some combination of other pressures that encourage people. And then I would just say that I think how I bound problems is like you have to eat a certain amount every day, and there's a physical connection that we understand of like how much crop we can grow and how that materially passes through different types of food aggregation and whatnot. And so I think there's like a lower bound of like of just how much land has to be occupied to meet food needs, and we can explore it through a variety of foods. But I mean, yeah, so that's kind of how I think about it. I'm a shush, but would love to follow up if I'll put my email in the chat. And
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Seems like a good moment to kind of move on towards closing the session. So Elisa, would you mind sharing the slides again? And I'll just try and kind of wrap up some of the things that we've talked about. And I'll also make sure that we like record all of the things that are in the chat so that we can share them on, because I can see like people have shared lots of interesting links and things. So it'd be great to keep that as a resource. But just to start thinking about closing the session then. So it seems like there's lots of ideas that have come up again and again. So things about kind of boundaries as being something that are kind of porous, they're not fixed, and that porosity is what's useful about them. Thinking about boundaries and places as something that's not just spatial, but it's also temporal, something that can kind of change through time, something that requires a kind of ongoing process of telling, re-narrating, shifting boundaries. Is something that is very temporal in nature. We've also talked a little bit about boundaries as roots into kind of ontology and epistemology. So how are we understanding the world? So Emily talked about seeing the world as resources, or different understandings of the ocean, connection to water, binaries between land and ocean, for example. Chris has also kind of brought us to thinking about epistemology and quantitative versus qualitative understandings of boundaries as well. We also raised lots of questions about boundaries. So what do we do when we have different understandings of boundaries to the people that we work with, or things like ecology not following boundaries in the way that we expect it to? Also, the emotional work involved in crossing boundaries and these different spaces that we create in our research. Some questions that we've raised. So kind of from an activist perspective, how do we use boundaries to generate action, but also recognize that boundary making in activist work is kind of creating this inside and outside, and that can be productive, but also create new challenges. And we've given lots of different examples, which are really useful. So things like oceans being a kind of territory which is really difficult to boundary, and that the language and data plays a huge role in kind of creating that boundary making. Tim talks about community land trusts, and that being an example of how we draw lines about who and who can't participate. And usually that's drawn around the idea of what is local. Boris gave us an example from literature, so thinking about Kafka's Castle and the role that bureaucracy plays and the challenge of kind of dissolving boundaries. And Elisa, right at the start, gave us examples of kind of boundary making and people coming from outside, maybe being labeled as troublemakers, but actually often doing really productive work in that way. So I guess that kind of the question maybe we can sort of close with is, how do we use boundaries to be kind of productive troublemakers, I guess. So how do we use those boundaries in new ways, subvert them, and try and do something different with them? So we've got a couple of quotes just to close with, if you wouldn't mind just sharing them, Elisa. So once they've appeared, these are 2 quotes I've kind of used in my PhD research, which I find quite helpful to keep coming back to. So the first one here, so place is always bounded, yet it's open and dynamic. This was written by Jeff Malpass, who is a geographer. So I'm a geographer, so I tend to always go back to geographical texts. What I find useful about this is this idea that, yes, in order for a place to be a place, it has a sense of a boundary. And that's a really important part of it. You know, this feeling that we're in one place, we cross a boundary and it's somewhere else. It's part of creating that identity. It can be used in that kind of policy work to kind of define who's included and who's not. But that doesn't mean that it's always exclusionary. It's something that's always open to change. As we've talked about, kind of those porous boundaries are really useful. So for me, that's something I've used when thinking about bioregions, is this idea that it's okay to think about things as bounded. And for the people I worked with, that was really important and useful. They would come into this idea of bioregions because it was doing something for them. It enabled them to see the world in a way, it enabled action, and it was useful kind of politically for them. But maintaining that openness was also essential to the kind of work that they were doing. The second quote here is by Ethan Miller. So how do we step boldly and affirmatively into a powerfully articulated political project, while at the same time holding open the space of ethical decision-making and the emptiness that constitutes its possibility? So this text, I don't know if everyone's read it, but it's a really useful one for thinking about community economies. And kind of Ethan talks about this tension between this kind of radical openness of community economies, where the community is kind of this state of togetherness, kind of interdependence that we can't kind of necessarily create or build. But that presents a challenge when you're trying to create a political project. You know, we're trying to build particular worlds. So what practices are we including and what are we excluding? So this kind of challenge of boundary making, where we keep the boundaries porous, but at the same time kind of hold some values about the worlds we want to build. So in all of our research, we've kind of moved between these productive understandings of boundaries. So for Elisa, this kind of relationship with land, but also land setting its own boundaries. In my research, a way of making interdependence visible and decentering humans. And for Will, boundary is something which is sometimes transgressed by academic researchers, and something that can be also kind of breached. Oh, I can't remember your 3 words now, Will, sorry. But yeah, the roles of boundaries in our research practice. So we'll close the session there, but thank you so much for all of your participation. We'll make sure to share all of the notes that we've generated, and I'll clean up what I've written so it's a little bit more coherent. But thank you very much, and please do get in contact with any of us if you want to carry on the conversations we've had today.
Will, I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Just to say thank you, Emily, and everyone in the US right now, sending lots of care this week. And yeah, it was really nice to meet all of you and have this discussion. So thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also like for the generosity in the chat, sharing links, all of that. This is what really makes Liviana such a good space for sharing and learning from each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day, everyone.
Cool. Sweet.
Well done,
Is
team.
the recording? Let me pause. Let me stop.